It was March 24, 1945, on the western bank of the Rhine River, near Wesel, Germany. The night was cold and wet, a heavy mist crawling low over the shattered floodplain. Floodlights swept briefly across the water, then dimmed again, blacked out against the threat of German artillery. In the silence between shells, the sound of hammers, steel pins, and shouted orders echoed through the dark. Dozens of American engineers, mud-streaked, sleepless, determined, worked by touch and memory. Each held a task in a dance they had practiced 100 times before. Slot a panel, drive a pin, brace a girder, move forward. Inch by inch, their bridge grew out from the shore, a Bailey bridge, section by section, until it reached the far bank. Behind them, Patton's Third Army waited, armor engines idling, tank crews tense, knowing that until this narrow track of steel touched the opposite shore, the war for them could not move forward. By dawn, it did. And in that single night, the U.S. Army built what German divisions had failed to destroy, a way across the Rhine. The story of how they did it began years earlier, in workshops, trials, and battlefields across Europe. To understand how American soldiers could assemble a steel bridge in a single night, one must go back, not to the Rhine, but to a modest design office in England. 1940, the British Army, still reeling from Dunkirk, faced a brutal realization. Nearly every river, canal, and stream in Western Europe had been turned into a military obstacle. Bridges, the veins of mobility, had been dynamited in retreat, leaving the continent scarred with chasms of twisted iron and concrete. The Germans, confident in their engineering and blitzkrieg momentum, had calculated that any army following them would move slowly, dependent on permanent structures. The Allies had to prove them wrong. Enter Donald Bailey, a quiet, bespectacled civil servant in Britain's War Office, who believed a bridge could be built like a puzzle, simple, strong, and modular. His idea defied convention, a portable, prefabricated truss bridge that could be carried in pieces, bolted together by untrained soldiers, and deployed under combat conditions without cranes or heavy machinery. It was, at first, an engineer's dream and a bureaucrat's nightmare. Critics doubted that a bridge made of modular steel panels could bear the weight of tanks like the Churchill or the Sherman. Bailey persisted. By late 1941, prototypes were being tested at the experimental bridging establishment in Christchurch, Dorset. The tests astonished everyone. The bridge, built by ordinary soldiers, not engineers, bore the load of a fully laden 40-ton tank. More than that, it could be extended, reinforced, or elevated simply by adding more panels and transoms. The genius was not in its strength alone, but in its simplicity. No bolts, no rivets, only steel pins and manpower. When the first production models rolled out of factories in 1942, they changed Allied warfare forever. As the war expanded, the Americans, preparing for their own entry into continental Europe, quickly recognized the Bailey Bridge as indispensable. Under the Lend-Lease program, thousands of sets were shipped to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Soon, American units were training side by side with their British counterparts, mastering the rhythm of construction, layout, pin, jack, push, launch. Every man knew his place, every piece its purpose. By 1943, entire engineer combat battalions could erect a 200-foot span in hours. In North Africa, the U.S. Army got its first taste of Bailey bridging in action. Roads through Tunisia were cratered or washed out by rain, but within days, American engineers had replaced wrecked crossings with Baileys that carried convoys, guns, and tanks toward the front. When the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943, engineers carried prefabricated bridge parts ashore along with ammunition and fuel. Each Bailey section came in wooden crates marked with stenciled numbers, every beam painted with color codes for rapid assembly. Within a week, engineers built spans over streams and craters, bridges that turned otherwise impassable terrain into highways for advancing armor. Still, Europe was different. North Africa had offered dry riverbeds and scattered infrastructure. Italy, by contrast, was a land of mountains, gorges, and rivers, swollen by autumn rains. The Italian campaign would test the Bailey Bridge in ways no design office could have imagined. As the Allies pushed north from Salerno toward Cassino, the Germans turned every bridge into a trap. They blew spans, mined approaches, and shelled crossings relentlessly. It was here, on muddy riverbanks under fire, that American engineers learned the deadly art of bridging in combat. Every hour counted. If armor could not cross, the infantry bled alone. Engineers of the 15th Engineer Combat Battalion, 9th Armored Division, and countless others became experts not only in steelwork, but in survival. Constructing bridges by night, under artillery flashes, guided only by the dim glow of covered lanterns and the whistle of their officers. Each Bailey completed under fire was more than a structure. It was proof that mobility itself could be weaponized. By early 1944, in the months leading to D-Day, American engineer units across Britain practiced the same method over and over. Unload, sort, assemble, launch. They built and dismantled mock bridges across English streams until they could do it blindfolded. The rhythm was everything: mechanical, relentless, efficient. What began as a British invention had become a cornerstone of American warfare, and soon, on the beaches of Normandy and the flooded plains of northern France, that rhythm would decide whether entire armies could advance or die standing still. The next stage of the story unfolds with the invasion itself, where rivers, canals, and enemy demolitions would turn engineering into a form of combat. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the beachhead was only the beginning. Behind the dramatic images of infantry rushing ashore and tanks grinding through surf lay a quieter, relentless struggle. The battle to keep those armies supplied and moving. The German retreat across France was brutal and methodical. Every major bridge across the Seine, the Loire, and the Somme was demolished. Roads were cratered, culverts blown, canals flooded. For the advancing Allies, the landscape became a maze of broken spans and impassable crossings. The only way forward was to build, and so the engineers became the unsung spearhead of the advance. In the days after D-Day, the first Bailey bridges went up across small Norman streams: the Vire, the Orne, the Douve, carrying columns of trucks and tanks inland from the beaches. They were thrown together by combat engineers under constant threat from snipers and artillery. Some bridges were built within sight of burning towns, others on ground so soft that engineers had to dig for hours just to anchor their base plates. Each bridge had a name: London, Eureka, Chicago, Treadway. They became symbols of speed, each one a signpost of progress across occupied France. By August 1944, as the Allies raced toward Paris, the Bailey Bridge was no longer an innovation. It was a lifeline. Engineer units moved almost as fast as armored columns, leapfrogging forward with trucks laden with prefabricated panels. A single bridge set, carried on 6 to 8 vehicles, could span up to 200 feet. With dozens of these sets assigned to each corps, the Allied armies could now perform what the Germans believed impossible: sustain mobile warfare across a continent in ruins. But the true test still lay ahead. In the autumn of 1944, the Siegfried Line, Germany's final defensive barrier, loomed across the western frontier. Beyond it, the Rhine River formed a natural moat, wide and swift, cutting through industrial heartland and fortified towns. Every crossing was a death trap. As Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters planned the final invasion of Germany, the Allied engineers faced their greatest challenge: bridging the great rivers under fire. In the Netherlands, operations like Market Garden in September 1944 exposed the limits of ambition. Paratroopers seized bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, but the attempt to reach Arnhem failed. Engineers arriving days later found the Rhine crossings destroyed, the remnants charred and scattered. Without them, the corridor collapsed. For months afterward, heavy rains turned the Low Countries into a bog. Rivers like the Maas, the Waal, and the Scheldt overflowed, and engineers fought not only the enemy, but nature itself. Still, they built. In the Scheldt estuary, Canadian and American units erected baileys across canals, marshes and dikes often underwater, connecting amphibious routes that finally opened the port of Antwerp in November 1944. Meanwhile, in the Ardennes, December brought the Battle of the Bulge, and with it, destruction on a staggering scale. Retreating German units blew every bridge they could reach, hoping to trap Allied armor in the frozen forests. American engineers, often cut off from supplies, scavenged wrecked Bailey components to assemble makeshift spans across icy streams. In Bastogne, bridges meant survival. They were the arteries through which ammunition and medical supplies flowed to the besieged troops. As the winter broke, the Allied High Command prepared for the final assault across the Rhine. Operation Plunder, scheduled for March 1945, would involve thousands of engineers and the largest bridging effort of the war. By then, the U.S. Army's Engineer Special Brigades had become a vast machine of mobility. Each battalion carried hundreds of tons of equipment: steel panels, transoms, decking, trucks, cranes, and pontoons. They had learned to build by night, to disguise their work with smoke, to repair under shell fire, and to launch entire bridges across rivers wider than football fields. The German defenders knew what was coming. They relied on the Rhine as their last barrier. Deep, swift, flanked by levees and anti-tank ditches. They believed it would take weeks for the Allies to cross. But Allied engineers, hardened by every broken bridge from Sicily to the Scheldt, had perfected a rhythm of speed and precision. For them, the Rhine was not an obstacle. It was the final test. And on those misty nights of March 1945, that test would unfold, a duel between steel and will. Between time and terrain, to see this story clearly, we must now look from different angles: human, tactical, and technological. The facets that together made the Bailey Bridge not just a tool, but a weapon of war. They called themselves mud soldiers, not infantry, not tankers, but men who built the ground the others walked on. An engineer's weapon was not a rifle, but a sledgehammer. His battlefield was the riverbank, cold, dark, and often under fire. In every campaign, from Italy to Germany, the engineers were among the first to arrive and the last to leave. Take a scene repeated hundreds of times. A convoy halts at a shattered bridge. The smell of burned timbers lingers. Twisted steel hangs like ribs over the water. Commanders pace. Artillery thunders in the distance. Then, without ceremony, the engineers begin. They unload the trucks. Panels clatter onto the mud, each weighing nearly 600 pounds. Teams of 6 lift, carry, and align them with the precision of a drill team. There's no shouting, only rhythm. Every man knows the order: base plates, transoms, stringers, deck. The work is back-breaking, but the tempo must never falter. Build fast, or men die waiting, an American officer once said during the Italian campaign. It wasn't an exaggeration. If the engineers failed, tanks could not advance. If tanks stalled, infantry suffered. Every delay meant casualties. The U.S. Army Engineer Combat Battalions trained for this reality. Their manuals emphasized speed over comfort, efficiency over sleep. A single bridge might take 8 to 12 hours to build, depending on river width and conditions. But in the field, under fire, those hours became minutes, measured in sweat and courage. Stories from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, which helped build bridges during the Ardennes and later across the Rhine, speak of men working waist-deep in freezing water, using ropes to steady each section as artillery shells struck upriver. They learned to distinguish the sounds, the whistle of incoming rounds versus the clang of steel pins locking panels. Fear became background noise. These soldiers rarely appeared in the headlines. They didn't take towns or raise flags, but every bridge they built carried tanks, trucks, ambulances, and entire divisions toward victory. In the end, their bridges were monuments not of glory, but of endurance. In modern warfare, victory belongs to the side that moves faster. The Bailey Bridge gave the Allies exactly that: mobility on demand. The German army in 1940 had mastered blitzkrieg, a combination of tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry advancing through surprise and speed. But by 1944 the tables had turned. Allied armor, supplied by relentless logistics and powered by bridging technology, could now move faster than German defenses could recover. Tactically, every bridge was a race against time. Rivers were natural choke points. If the enemy could delay a crossing by even a single day, reinforcements could arrive, or air support could reposition. The Bailey Bridge turned those delays into hours, not days. Each Bailey set was modular. Engineers could build a single, double, or even triple truss configuration, depending on load requirements. If tanks needed to cross, the design could be reinforced on the spot by doubling the panels. If the river was too wide, pontoons could be attached beneath, transforming it into a floating structure. Commanders soon realized what this meant. A destroyed bridge no longer slowed an army. It only redirected it. During the Normandy breakout, Patton's forces advanced through France at nearly 30 miles per day. Behind the speed of his tanks was a chain of Bailey bridges spanning every obstacle. In official reports, one engineer joked that they were laying steel highways across Europe. The bridge's simplicity also allowed for unprecedented coordination. While infantry and armor secured one bank, engineers could prepare components on the other. Once the last shots fell silent, the launch began. A synchronized motion of men and machinery pushing the completed truss outward on rollers until it touched the far shore. The moment that connection was made, supply convoys rolled forward. To the Germans, this tempo was bewildering. Their doctrine assumed that blown bridges would buy time to regroup, fortify, and counterattack. Instead, Allied engineers rebuilt them before dawn. By the time German reconnaissance reported a river impassable, American armor was already across it. Bailey bridges, in essence, turned terrain, one of war's oldest weapons, into a temporary inconvenience. The result was a new kind of warfare, logistics-led, mechanized, relentless. Engineers were no longer behind the lines. They were at the heart of the offensive, wielding steel instead of gunfire to keep the war moving forward. From the human grit on riverbanks to the tactical brilliance in headquarters maps, one truth became clear. The Bailey Bridge wasn't just a structure. It was a strategy. But there was more behind its success. The cold precision of design, the strength of its materials, and the innovation that allowed soldiers to turn blueprints into lifelines under fire. At its core, the Bailey Bridge was not revolutionary because it was complex, but because it was simple. Each bridge was composed of a small set of standardized steel parts: panels, transoms, stringers, and decking planks. The entire system could be built without heavy machinery, welding, or bolts, only steel pins and manpower. The design was modular, meaning soldiers could build any length or load capacity by repeating sections. Each panel measured 10 feet long, 5 feet high, and could be handled by 6 men. The design was intentionally within the limits of human strength. Soldiers could carry each piece, align it, and hammer the pins into place with sledgehammers. The secret of the Bailey lay in its geometry. The lattice truss transferred the weight from vehicles through interlocking triangles, the strongest shape in engineering, allowing it to bear loads far greater than its own mass. By doubling or tripling the panels side by side, engineers could create heavier configurations, designated Class 40, Class 70, or higher, depending on the weight they needed to support. It was a system born from the mind of a civil servant, but perfected by soldiers in the field. What made it truly superior was its adaptability. The Bailey could be built as a fixed bridge, resting on piers, or as a floating bridge, mounted on pontoons and launched across water. It could span 30 feet or 300. The same parts could be reused, reassembled, and extended. American engineers quickly mastered the variations, the single-single, double-single, and double-double configurations. The terms might sound mechanical, but on the battlefield, they meant life or death. Choosing the wrong load rating could mean a bridge collapsing under a tank column. Choosing the right one meant an entire division moving before dawn. Factories across Britain and the United States mass-produced the components in staggering numbers. By 1944, over 490,000 tons of Bailey equipment had been manufactured. Each set was standardized so completely that an American-built panel could fit seamlessly with a British one. That precision, industrial, mathematical, and logistical, allowed the Allies to deploy Bailey bridges from Normandy to Burma with the same efficiency. This technological harmony symbolized Allied cooperation itself. British ingenuity, American production, and Canadian logistics combined to create one of the most important engineering achievements of the war. And yet, the true power of the Bailey Bridge was not in its steel, it was in its speed. A trained crew could assemble a 100-foot Class 40 bridge in under 8 hours. In emergencies, that time could be halved. Nothing in the German arsenal came close. German engineers built magnificent structures, strong, elegant, permanent, but they were slow. Their bridges required cranes, scaffolding, and specialized machinery. When those tools were destroyed or captured, the Wehrmacht lost its mobility. The Allies, in contrast, carried their bridges in pieces on trucks, ready to assemble anywhere, anytime. In that difference lay a silent revolution. Industrial flexibility as a weapon of war. For every bridge built, there was a bridge destroyed. The German army had learned through bitter experience that mobility, not firepower, determined survival. As they retreated through France and the Low Countries, their strategy was simple. Deny crossings at all costs. Bridges were rigged with explosives, approaches mined. Riverbanks fortified with machine guns and anti-tank guns. Some demolitions were works of precision. Charges placed on key load points to collapse spans cleanly into the river. Others were hasty, leaving twisted girders half submerged, making reconstruction a nightmare. German engineers even used delayed fuses, detonating hours after Allied troops arrived, to catch repair parties off guard. But the Allied engineers adapted faster. In Normandy, when a bridge near St. Lo was destroyed just as American armor approached, engineers salvaged the wreckage to build a hybrid structure, part Bailey, part remains of the original. It carried the 2nd Armored Division across the same day. In Belgium, during the pursuit to the Meuse River, engineers encountered gaps too wide for standard Baileys. Instead of halting, they improvised, mounting sections on pontoons, using rafts to ferry tanks until the bridge could be completed. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine, these improvisations had become doctrine. The Germans, realizing the danger, increased their countermeasures. They shelled construction sites, strafed them with aircraft, and flooded lowlands by opening dam gates. But even these tactics failed. Allied air superiority kept the skies clear, and smoke screens cloaked the engineers' night work. Every obstacle the Germans devised only refined Allied methods. For every demolition charge, there was a repair technique. For every flooded plain, There was a pontoon solution. The Bailey Bridge had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a mindset of adaptation. As German commanders watched the Allies cross river after river, disbelief turned to resignation. Where once they could predict weeks of delay, now the Americans built bridges overnight. The terrain that had saved them in 1940 had become meaningless by 1945, and that was the moment when engineering, not artillery or tanks, became the decisive factor of the war in the West. The convergence of human endurance, tactical speed, technological genius, and enemy adaptation all led to one defining event: the crossing of the Rhine. The river that had once symbolized Germany's invincibility would, in the hands of the Allies, become a symbol of its defeat. The crossing of the Rhine, March 1945. For 6 years, the Rhine River had been the line of destiny in Europe. Wide, swift, and lined with concrete defenses, it was Germany's last great natural barrier, a frontier the Nazis believed no Allied army could breach quickly. Every bridge from Cologne to Wesel had been rigged for destruction. Many already lay in ruins. German commanders assumed it would take weeks for engineers to span the river under fire. They were wrong. The Allies had planned Operation Plunder, a vast assault to cross the Rhine between Ries, Wesel, and Rheinberg, supported by airborne drops under Operation Varsity. But days before the offensive, fate handed them an opportunity. On March 7, 1945, a reconnaissance patrol from the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the town of Remagen and saw the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. The Germans had prepared demolition charges, but their fuses failed. Under artillery and sniper fire, American troops stormed the bridge, cutting wires and driving across before it could collapse. The world was stunned. Within 24 hours, the first Allied bridgehead east of the Rhine was secured. But Remagen was fragile. The structure was old, damaged, and constantly shelled. Within 10 days, it collapsed into the river, killing 28 engineers and wounding dozens more. Yet, the message was clear. The Rhine could be crossed. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army further south, was determined to do it on his own terms. Not with luck, but with engineering. His headquarters selected a crossing site near Oppenheim, south of Mainz. There, on the night of March 22-23, 1945, under a moonless sky, the engineers of the 5th and 160th Engineer Combat Battalions began their work. The river was 400 yards wide, its current fast, its banks steep. German artillery fire from the east bank erupted sporadically, forcing the men to halt, duck, and resume their rhythm in the darkness. They started with treadway bridges, floating steel sections supported by pontoons. Amphibious vehicles, known as DUKWs, ferried the first infantry across. Then came the real test: the construction of a Bailey Bridge strong enough for armor. Trucks roared in with prefabricated panels. Men unloaded them in silence, working by touch and the dim light of covered lanterns. On the far bank, bursts of tracer fire marked the German line. Smoke shells drifted low, masking the river. Engineers shouted brief commands over the hammering of pins. Each section was launched on rollers, pushed forward across pontoons until it reached the opposite shore. The rhythm was relentless: fit, pin, drive, slide. Despite the current and the constant threat of incoming fire, the bridge advanced foot by foot. By dawn, a 280-foot span stretched from west to east, the first Bailey Bridge across the Rhine. Within hours, Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division were rumbling over it, their tracks ringing on the steel decking. Patton, ever theatrical, crossed the bridge himself and sent a message to headquarters. "Dear Ike, I crossed the Rhine with 1 division. No casualties. God be with you, George." It was a moment of triumph not just for the general, but for the men who had made it possible. the engineers who had turned rivers into roads. Meanwhile, further north near Wesel, British and U.S. forces launched Operation Plunder in full force. At midnight on March 23-24, under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, thousands of artillery guns opened fire. The night sky over the Rhine turned red. Behind the bombardment, the U.S. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions parachuted into Germany, securing the far bank. And then, as the shells lifted, the engineers began their own assault. One fought not with bullets, but with rivets and pins. At Wesel, the 15th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 204th Engineer Combat Battalion began constructing a Class 40 Bailey Bridge. Working under enemy artillery, they launched it section by section into the black water, guided by ropes and headlights shrouded in mud. By sunrise, their bridge, codenamed White Rhino, was open. Within hours, trucks and tanks were streaming into Germany. In all, during Operation Plunder, Allied engineers built 5 major bridges across the Rhine in less than 4 days, a feat even German engineers considered impossible. The Germans had prepared for a static war, believing the river would buy them time. The Allies turned it into a fluid one, using speed as their weapon. Each Bailey Bridge erected was not just a crossing, but a statement. The war would not wait. And for the soldiers on those riverbanks, soaked, exhausted, and deafened by the roar of artillery, the moment their bridge reached the far bank was more than a tactical success. It was the sound of victory being built, one steel pin at a time. But the work wasn't over. As tanks rolled east and the Rhine faded behind them, the engineers faced their most dangerous hours, keeping those fragile crossings open under relentless attack. The Rhine crossings had succeeded. But, for the engineers, the battle was only half won. The bridges that brought victory were now targets. German artillery zeroed in on the newly completed spans within hours of their first use. Shells whistled overhead, smashing into water and embankments, throwing up geysers of mud and shrapnel. On the riverbanks, engineers worked without pause, repairing hits, replacing sections, and clearing wreckage. Each impact tested not just the bridge, but the resolve of the men who kept it standing. At Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge became the most fought-over structure in Europe. German bombers, artillery, and even V-2 rockets were directed against it. Still, for 10 precious days, it carried thousands of troops and vehicles across. Engineers reinforced its trusses with Bailey sections, bolting new steel to the old frame while shells fell around them. When it finally collapsed on March 17th, it had already served its purpose. A bridgehead had been secured, and pontoon and Bailey bridges downstream had taken over the flow of traffic. At Wesel, Rhine, and Oppenheim, the work never stopped. During Operation Plunder, more than 16,000 engineers toiled on the Rhine's western bank. Their tasks went far beyond construction. They ferried infantry in assault boats, anchored pontoons, managed cable ferries, and cleared mines from approaches. Every job was urgent. If a span failed, entire armies would stall. The Germans, desperate to slow the advance, used every means available. Mortar fire, snipers, and floating mines drifted downstream. Luftwaffe planes, what few remained, made suicidal attacks on the bridges at night. Yet the Allies' air cover and anti-aircraft guns kept losses minimal. The engineers had learned long before that the greatest defense was speed. Finish before the enemy could react. Perhaps no image captured this better than that of Patton's engineers at Oppenheim. In the early morning of March 23rd, after the first armor rolled across, the fog lifted to reveal a sight the Germans could hardly believe. 2 Bailey bridges side by side, gleaming with dew, stretching solidly across the Rhine. German prisoners who saw it later described the shock. "We thought the river was our shield," one said. "But you crossed as if it were nothing." It wasn't nothing. Every span came at a cost. The 204th Engineer Combat Battalion lost men to shell fire while working in waist-deep water. The 291st Battalion, veterans of the Bulge, suffered multiple casualties when their bridge at Wesel was struck during construction. Yet even as medics carried away the wounded, replacements stepped into their positions. The work went on. By the end of March, Allied forces had built more than 35 major bridges over the Rhine, including Bailey, pontoon, and treadway types. The speed was astonishing. Some Class 40 Bailey bridges, capable of carrying medium tanks, were completed in under 12 hours. Others, spanning over 400 feet, took just 2 days. In contrast, German engineers during the early war years had often needed weeks to rebuild similar crossings under far less hostile conditions. The comparison wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. The Allies had mastered the art of industrial improvisation. They could turn destruction into mobility overnight. For the frontline troops, these bridges became more than structures. They were lifelines to the West, arteries pumping fuel, food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Soldiers crossing them often slowed their vehicles to look at the engineers still working on the edges, mud-streaked and unshaven, tightening bolts, checking cables. Many saluted them in silence. There was also pride, quiet, enduring pride, among the engineers themselves. They knew that while others fought for glory, they fought for momentum. Their success wasn't measured in medals, but in miles gained. In official reports after the Rhine crossings, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recorded feats that bordered on the unbelievable. At Bad Neuenahr, a 1,000-foot floating Bailey Bridge was completed in just 36 hours, a record for its type. At Mainz, engineers launched a 600-foot double-double truss span under direct artillery fire, without a single section failing. German prisoners who inspected the captured sites often remarked on the sheer scale of the operation. One Wehrmacht engineer, upon seeing a completed Bailey, reportedly muttered, "It took us weeks to build something half as strong." By early April 1945, the Rhine, once Hitler's vaunted impenetrable barrier, had become a series of Allied causeways. Tanks rolled eastward toward the Ruhr, the Elbe, and, finally, the heart of Germany. The bridges behind them groaned under the weight of victory. Convoys of armor, artillery, refugees, and supply trucks, a ceaseless river of men and metal flowing into the Reich. And on those banks, when the thunder of tanks faded and the smoke lifted, the engineers stood quietly, watching their work hold firm. They knew what few others did, that wars were not only won by the men who fought on the front lines, but by those who built the paths they fought upon. The Rhine had been crossed. The end of the European war was now a matter of weeks. Yet the story of the Bailey Bridge did not end with the sound of tank treads on steel. Its legacy would be measured in the aftermath, in the rebuilding of Europe, the lessons of logistics, and the quiet transformation of warfare itself. When the thunder of the guns along the Rhine finally began to fade, the bridges remained, stark silhouettes of steel against the dawn. They had done their work. By April 1945, the Allied armies were pouring into the heart of Germany. The speed of their advance stunned even their own commanders. What was expected to take months unfolded in weeks. The reason was simple. Mobility had triumphed over defense. Every major advance in those final weeks, the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, the push toward Leipzig, and the final drive to the Elbe River, relied on the same rhythm that had carried the Allies from Normandy to the Rhine. When German resistance collapsed, it did so not only under bombing or firepower, but under the relentless logistical momentum the engineers had made possible. The official reports from the U.S. Army, Corps of Engineers read less like dispatches from war and more like records of an industrial miracle. In March and April 1945 alone, engineers constructed over 1,000 bridges in Germany, nearly 300 Bailey bridges among them. Each crossing varied in size and complexity, from small 40-foot tactical spans to colossal 1,000-foot floating bridges across rivers swollen by spring rains. At Wesel, where Operation Plunder had begun, more than 3,000 vehicles crossed within the first 24 hours of the Bailey's completion. By the end of that week, the figure had reached over 30,000. Engineers had to reinforce decking daily to keep up with the sheer traffic load. The bridges became living arteries, constantly maintained, expanded, and repaired. The effect on German morale was devastating. Intelligence reports captured from Wehrmacht field headquarters reveal astonishment and despair. "The Americans bridge faster than we can destroy," one officer wrote. Another noted grimly, "Every night they build new roads over the rivers. Our positions lose meaning by morning." Even Hitler, in his final weeks, raged at the failure of the Rhine to hold. He blamed sabotage, cowardice, and fate. But the truth was simpler. The Bailey Bridge had erased the last advantage terrain once gave him. No matter how many rivers or canals lay ahead, the Allies could cross them almost at will. For the men of the engineer battalions, there was no pause for reflection. The war still demanded constant motion. Bridges built one day were dismantled and rebuilt the next, sometimes multiple times as front lines shifted. The 50th Engineer Combat Battalion, for instance, built 10 Bailey bridges in just 17 days across western Germany. Their records show an average construction time of 9 hours per span, a pace unimaginable before the war. Losses remained high. Even as the German army disintegrated, snipers and artillery sporadically targeted bridge sites. Mines floated downriver. Equipment failed under strain. Yet the engineers pressed on, sustained by a simple creed. If the bridge stands, the army moves. Their endurance turned into a quiet legend among the troops. Tankers and truck drivers often scrawled chalk messages on the side rails of Baileys they crossed. "Thanks, engineers," or "Keep 'em coming." A few bridges even earned nicknames that survived into peacetime. Black Widow, Liberty Bridge, Victory Span. Behind the front lines, logistics officers calculated the unimaginable. The rate of supply, food, ammunition, and fuel, reaching the front across Bailey bridges, was now greater than any army in history had achieved. The modular bridge had made industrial-scale mobility a tactical weapon. But even as the Allies surged ahead, engineers remained haunted by the memory of those who didn't make it off the riverbanks. Hundreds of engineers were killed during the crossings of 1944-45, many buried beside the very bridges they built. Some were washed away by the current, others died tightening bolts under enemy fire. Their names appeared in brief lines of after-action reports, rarely in headlines. Still, their work had changed the course of the war. As Germany crumbled and Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, the bridges they left behind became silent monuments, proof that steel, sweat, and discipline could accomplish what bombs and guns alone could not: the conquest of distance. Yet the true power of the Bailey Bridge was not only in victory, but in what came after. When the guns stopped, Europe was a landscape of ruins, and those same bridges would soon serve a new purpose: rebuilding. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the bridges that had carried the armies of liberation became the bridges of recovery. The same Bailey spans that once bore tanks and convoys now carried trucks of food, medical supplies, and refugees. Across the Rhine, the Ruhr, and the Elbe, engineers who had fought their way into Germany turned to a different kind of mission: reconstruction. Entire cities lay in ruin. Bridges were gone, rail lines twisted, power plants gutted. Yet the Allied armies, facing the colossal task of feeding millions and restoring transport, already had a ready-made solution in their convoys: Bailey components. What had served as a tactical weapon in war became a humanitarian tool in peace. Thousands of Bailey sections were reassembled into temporary civilian bridges to reconnect villages, reopen railways, and allow displaced persons to return home. The same ingenuity that had carried Patton's armor across the Rhine now carried Europe back toward survival. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Bailey bridges remained in daily use for years after the war. In some places, they endured for decades. A handful still stand today, rusted, repainted, but intact. Silent relics of a time when victory depended on speed and precision. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers preserved meticulous records of their wartime accomplishments. Their statistics were staggering. Over 2,500 major Bailey bridges, built by U.S. forces in the European theater, spanning a combined distance of more than 500 miles. Millions of vehicles and untold tons of supplies crossed those structures between 1943 and 1945. But behind those numbers were stories. Quiet, enduring ones. In one after-action report from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, the commander wrote, "Our bridges were the first to feel the weight of victory." Another, from the 9th Armored Division engineers who held Remagen, concluded simply, "We built so others could cross." That was enough. For military strategists, the Bailey Bridge became a case study in how logistics could win wars. It embodied the doctrine that mobility, not merely firepower, defined modern warfare. In the post-war years, the bridge's design was studied by armies across the world. Nations as far as India, Australia, and Canada adopted its system. Many developing nations used surplus Allied Baileys to build their first permanent river crossings. In the United States, Bailey's concept influenced generations of military engineering. It became the foundation for the M2 Treadway Bridge, the Medium Girder Bridge, and later, modular bridging systems that carried tanks from the Cold War to Iraq and beyond. The principle remained the same: speed through simplicity. For Europe, the bridge held a deeper symbolism. It was both the instrument of invasion and the architecture of recovery. The line between war and peace made of riveted steel. On the same banks where men once fought to cross, children would later walk to school across those bridges. When Donald Bailey, the man whose name the bridge bore, received his knighthood from King George VI in 1946, he remained humble. He credited not the design alone, but the soldiers who had turned theory into triumph. In his acceptance, he said quietly, "The bridge was only as strong as the men who built it." That sentiment became its legacy. In the years that followed, the Bailey Bridge was exported to every continent. It spanned mountain passes in Burma, jungles in Malaysia, and valleys in Korea. Even decades after the war, disaster zones, from floods to earthquakes, called for Bailey bridges, assembled by local hands in the same way they were on the banks of the Rhine. Its endurance proved that good design outlives its era. By the 1950s, much of Europe had rebuilt its permanent bridges, but the Bailey's influence never faded. It had proven that engineering, once a quiet profession, could decide the fate of nations. As the last Bailey bridges of the war aged into history, they left behind not just rivets and rust, but a lesson that the power to move armies, to rebuild nations, and to heal a continent could come from a handful of men, a few trucks, and the will to build through the night. The rivers had been crossed. The war was over, but the bridge, and what it symbolized, would live on. At dawn, the rivers of Europe are quiet again. Where gunfire once echoed, there is only the sound of water beneath steel. The same rivers that once divided armies now binding nations together. The Bailey Bridge endures not as a monument of conquest, but as a symbol of human ingenuity under pressure. It was born from necessity, perfected through struggle, and immortalized by the hands of ordinary soldiers who built it in darkness, under fire, with nothing but courage and precision. In a war defined by destruction, it was an act of creation. Each bridge was a promise, that no obstacle, however vast or violent, could stop the movement of free men determined to finish what they had begun. It reminds us that victory in war is not only the triumph of weapons, but of will, organization, and imagination. The same men who laid down steel under shell fire later used it to rebuild schools, roads, and homes. In doing so, they proved that engineering, so often silent in the shadows of war, could be an instrument of peace. The Bailey Bridge was never glamorous. It had no hero's face, no anthem, no parade. But it carried the weight of victory, literally. Over its panels rolled the vehicles that liberated Europe, fed its people, and rebuilt its cities. And even now, when one stands beside an old Bailey span, rusting in the countryside, its trusses laced with ivy, its deck worn smooth by decades, it speaks quietly of the night it was born, a night when men with hammers and torches stood against time and chaos, and built a road where none existed. In that steel, there is the echo of their hands. In its endurance, the reflection of their resolve. The Bailey Bridge was more than an invention. It was a bridge between war and peace, between destruction and rebuilding. Proof that in the darkest hours of history, humanity still knew how to build.